that we've had a few criticisms of the things that we do around the world in different places. All the different, you'll find a hospital that has a high mortality rate, will find the Department of Public Health somewhere who will find some little thing which they criticise, and then they can write a paper in the BMJ, and people will say, oh, look at that paper in the BMJ, we'll take no notice. And in fact, I was at a meeting fairly recently, and the chief executive of large trusts, hospital trusts in this country, said to me, his medical officer had come along after the publication from the Birmingham Group in March last year and slapped the paper down and said, look, it's all rubbish, we don't need to do anything. And that is what happens, unfortunately. And what we found is when they do look into it carefully, as a Bristol, they reduce the mortality. They do what is necessary. And the parents of those children who were dying were saying, quite rightly, why didn't you tell us that we could have got a mortality rate of 6% rather than 29%? We could have just driven 1 hour up the motorway and got 6%. And that is correct. Now they say that it is a blunt instrument. Some people say, well, why don't you cover 100% of all deaths? Because we look at 80% of deaths, the major diagnoses. And the reason why we do that is that when you get to the minor illnesses with relatively few deaths, statistically, you have to have too many to be abnormal. So let's concentrate on the big ones, is what we say. It's difficult enough doing that. We concentrate on that. And it is I mean, we don't say that if an HSMR is high, it means that it's high death rate in all illnesses. Of course, it's not necessarily so. What it can be is one department is high, another might be low, but the overall figure is high. How do we deal with that? The way we deal with that is we look at the data at each individual patient level of admission for every diagnosis. So we follow them. So when a patient comes in, we look at all the patients that come in, let's say with atrial fibrillation, or whatever it is, or some form of dysrhythmia. And we follow and we look to see whether the patient dies or not. And we plot it in a continuous sum. We continue to add up the numbers of deaths and the numbers of risks of death. So a patient comes with AF, there's a risk of death of 16%. Now if the patient comes in and doesn't die, then the line goes down a little bit. And it goes down the amount according to the risk. If the risk was high, it goes down a long way. If the risk was low, it goes down a little way. But if the patient dies and the risk was low, then it goes up a long way. But if the risk was high, it goes up a little bit. So you've got lines adding up and zigzagging all the time, adding up all the time the sums of the deaths and the risks of deaths, until you get to a point when the numbers of deaths exceeds the risk of death significantly. We choose a point where we are unlikely to get a false indication trigger of less than 1 in 1,000 that it's likely to have been by chance. And those are what we call our monthly mortality alerts. Now the monthly data is because we originally only got the data from the hospital statistics every year. But hospitals were saying to us, we want monthly data. So we had to arrange, and actually it costs a lot of money that's where the Dr. Foster actually came in, because I think it was something around £10,000 per hospital to get the monthly data. So they have to charge that to the hospitals. They get it for us, we do the calculation. So getting the monthly data means that we can get to a point every month we can say, now, statistically, for this particular diagnosis, for these particular patients, and we can give every single one of the patients, not the names, you can't identify the patient, but if it is the clinician that's involved, they probably would be able to pick out the patient from the notes because they know the details of the treatment. But our data is anonymized. We have 500 million cases on our computers, which are very sort of confidential. And we get to the point where, for a particular diagnosis, they've reached a signal, a trigger, and we say, okay, for acute myocardial infarction, let's say heart attack, stroke, whatever you like to think of, the diagnoses covering most of the deaths, we send a letter to the chief exec of that acute trust saying, we have found this trigger that indicates that maybe within this particular diagnosis you are significantly high, with a chance of our getting a false signal of less than 1 in 1,000. Would you like to look at it? Don't say it is wrong, because they may have miscoded it or whatever, but we are giving them the information to do so. But what I'm trying to say is that we look at it both from the macro HSNR level and at the micro individual patient diagnosis level. In addition, every clinician that I've spoken to has said to me, there's a problem with coding. Sharon along the corridor doesn't know a thing about coding. She's the coder and she doesn't understand me, etc. Well,